you taking this opportunity to have me talk a little bit about Quakers and their relationships historically and contemporarily with Christmas. As Rachel said, I teach comparative religion. It's something I really like to do, and it's something that I think really lends itself to this topic. And my PhD work focused on early Quakers and their relationship to earlier Catholic heresies. And so my PhD work really focused on where Quakerism fits in the larger Christian framework. And the Quaker relationship to Christmas really fits well into that topic. So this was a topic I was really excited about and very interested in presenting. As Rachel said, I will be stopping occasionally to answer questions. I'm going to try not to answer them directly as they come up in order to maintain the flow of the presentation. But if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the question box, and I will answer it when I get to a breaking point. So as I said, some of you know that I teach comparative religion. And one of the things that I teach my students is that religions are not homogenous. They vary on a global, a regional, and a local level. And Quakerism, as it relates to Christmas, is no exception. There are probably about as many different ways to celebrate Christmas in the Quaker world as there are Quakers. And so that's something we'll be talking about a little bit later in the presentation when we get to look at contemporary Quakerism's relationship to Christmas. Another thing that I teach my students, and it's really important to understanding the Quaker relationship to Christmas, is that is that religions change over time. They evolve and they change dramatically from one generation to the next. And the relationship between Christmas is no different with Quakerism. The modern Quaker view of Christmas is dramatically different from that of the early Friends, and even those Friends in the 18th and 19th centuries. But I feel like in order to understand modern Quakers and their views on Christmas, it's really important to have an understanding of the early Friends' views. But you have to go one step further than that. And in order to understand early Friends' views, it is important to understand a little bit of the history of Christmas. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to be sharing with everybody, so let me pull that up now so that we can have that. What you'll see here are some different representations of Quakers in Christmas and how it's celebrated. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to contemporary Quakerism. So the middle of winter has long been a celebration, a time of celebration around the world. Centuries before the arrival of Jesus, early Europeans celebrated light and birth in the darkest days of winter. Many people rejoiced during the winter solstice when the worst of winter was behind them and they could look forward to longer days and extended hours of sunlight. And just a little bit from a personal level, I know my wife is incredibly excited for those days. She hates winter because it gets dark so early. And we've got a couple days to the winter solstice, so this is really an appropriate time to be doing this. The end of December was a perfect time for celebration in most areas of Europe. At that time of year, most cattle were slaughtered so that they would not have to feed them during the winter, and it provided a source of fresh meat that most people wouldn't otherwise have. In addition, most of the wine and beer made during the year was finally fermented and ready for drinking, and both of those facts lended itself to a time of celebration and joy. In Rome, where the winters were not as harsh as those in the far north, there was a holiday called Saturnalia, a holiday to honor the god Saturn, who was the god of agriculture. Beginning in the week leading up to the winter solstice and continuing for a full month after, Saturnalia was a hedonistic time when food and drink were plentiful, and the normal Roman social order was turned upside down. For a month, slaves became masters. Peasants were in command of the city. Businesses and schools were closed so that everybody could join in the fun. Also around the time of the winter solstice, Roman observed another holiday called Juvenalia, a feast honoring the children of Rome. Gifts were exchanged and given to the children at this time. And along with these two holidays, there was a third one that was often celebrated by members of the upper classes that celebrated the birthday of Mithra, the god of the unconquerable sun. And this happened on December 25th. For many Romans, Mithra's birthday was the most sacred day of the year. Both of those will become important, or all three of those will become important when we get to talking about Christmas and Christianity and Quakers in general. In the early years of Christianity, Easter was the main holiday. The birth of Jesus was not celebrated. It wasn't until the 4th century when church officials decided to institute a holiday celebrating the birth of Jesus. Unfortunately for those early church leaders, the Bible does not mention a date for his birth. A fact, as we'll see, that Quakers later pointed out in order to deny the legitimacy of the celebration. Although some evidence suggests that his birth may have occurred in the spring, why would shepherds be herding in the middle of winter? Pope Julius I chose December 25th as the day to celebrate this new holiday. It is commonly believed that the church chose this date in order to adopt and absorb the traditions of the pagan Saturnalia, Julianalia, and celebration of Mithras. First called the Feast of Nativity, the custom spread to Egypt by 432 and to England by the end of the 6th century. So you can start to see the Christian attempt to bring in traditions that were already familiar and comfortable for people in order to make them more palatable. And Christmas was one of these main attempts by the Roman authorities to try to bring together non-Christians into the Christian fold. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, pagan traditions were increasingly incorporated into Christianity in order to help the people transition into the faith. With the takeover of pagan worship, pagan practices and festivals, and pagan worship spaces. Spaces such as the Pantheon in Rome were converted to churches. Pagan religious practices were folded into Christianity. Pagan iconography was reimagined as Christian. And many of the Christmas traditions that we celebrate today have a pagan origin. And as you can see by the slide I have up now, these are just some of the many Christmas traditions that we can trace back to pagan sources, including commonly understood Christmas traditions like Santa, green leaves and red berries, laurel wreaths, group singing, and candles. So from the start, Christmas was a attempt to sort of superimpose Christianity onto earlier pagan traditions. And by holding Christmas at the same time as traditional winter solstice festivals, church leaders were increasing the chances that Christianity would be popularly embraced. But they gave up the ability to dictate how it was celebrated. As time went on, Christmas traditions evolved and expanded to include pagan traditions and new traditions as well. And by the Middle Ages, Christianity had, for the most part, replaced all of the other pagan religions. On Christmas, believers would attend church, then celebrate raucously in a drunken, carnival-like atmosphere that would probably be most familiar to us as something along the lines of Mardi Gras. Each year, a beggar or student would be crowned the Lord of Misrule, and eager celebrants played the part of his subjects. The poor would go to the houses of the rich and demand their best food and drink. If owners failed to comply, their visitors would most likely terrorize them with mischief. Christmas became the time of year when the upper classes could repay their real or imagined debt to society by entertaining less fortunate citizens. By the early 17th century, a wave of religious reform had changed the way Christmas was celebrated in Europe, particularly in Protestant countries such as Germany, the Low Countries, and England. By the time of Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan forces in England in 1645, there was an attempt to remove non-biblical and pagan traditions from the traditional Christian celebration. They vowed to rid England of decadence, and as a part of their effort, they canceled Christmas. With the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, Christmas was restored, but these views or these desires to rid Christmas of its, or Christianity and Christmas in particular, of its pagan roots was still very much in favor. As English settlers moved to America, they brought these same feelings with them. For instance, the Pilgrims, who settled obviously in the north part of the continent, were even more orthodox in their Puritan beliefs than Cromwell. And as a result, Christmas was not a holiday in that part of America for a long time. From 1659 to 1681, the celebration of Christmas was actually outlawed in Boston, and anyone exhibiting Christmas spirit was fined 5 shillings. You could contrast this with Jamestown, settled in Virginia by Captain John Smith, who reported that Christmas was enjoyed by all and passed without incident. For Quakers who settled in Pennsylvania, they settled alongside the Germans and the Dutch. And because while Quakers themselves rejected Christmas as a holiday, the Germans and Dutch did not. And so in Pennsylvania in particular, you had a weird mismatch of some groups celebrating Christmas with traditional practices, while others, like the Quakers, they did not. Stores were kept open, schools were kept in session, and daily life was maintained. For Quakers, this continued well into the 18th century. So let's talk a little bit about the Quakers. Early friends described the Quaker movement as primitive Christianity restored or revived. But they had a distinctive interpretation of Christianity that was passionately opposed to the Orthodox Protestant theology of their day. The earliest Quakers rejected religious dogmatism, authoritarianism, and collusion with powerful elites quite as vehemently as many modern-day non-theists. Early Quakers believed that they had rediscovered the core insights of Jesus and the first Christians, which official church teachings had systematically evaded, ignored, or misrepresented since the first century. Thus, the Quakers rejected many aspects of their contemporary Christian or other pagan traditions. These included rejection of the sacraments, rejection of the priesthood, rejection of pagan month and day names, rejection of formalized worship, and the rejection of non-biblical traditions. Quakers strove to reestablish the form of faith which was present during the time of Christ and the apostles. They worked to create a movement which would give them a spiritual home, to satisfy the sense of searching they experienced in post-Civil War England. The rejection of pagan and non-biblical traditions led Quakers to reject the raucous Christmas holiday, which violated many of the prohibitions they held. A quote from George Fox's journal reflects the views of Christmas, his views of Christmas. When the time called Christmas came, while others were feasting and sporting themselves, I looked out poor widows from house to house and gave them some money. George Fox, George Fox and other early Christian Quakers sought to reject any form of Catholic tradition. and that became important in their relationship to Christmas. This is a quote from a letter George Fox wrote to Oliver Cromwell and the Parliament of England sometime around 1658. And in this quote, you can see directly where George Fox and the other Quakers fell on their views of Christmas. Where do you read of the apostles, or but since the days of the apostles and the apostasy, call the days by the name of Christmas? Laying out Christmas in this way was an attempt to show Parliament and Oliver Cromwell, as well as other groups, what the Quakers really viewed Christmas as being. Something that was created by the Pope and did not have any direct relationship to biblical traditions. Fox, along with other early Quakers, spoke out about the relationship between Christmas and other holy days as it related to the Pope and Catholic teachings. They basically argued that because these were created after the time of Jesus and the apostles, they were false teachings and contributed to the drifting away from the mandate Christ left for his followers. This quote from a pamphlet printed by George Fox and Francis Hogwell, again highlights the Quaker view that not just Christmas, but other holidays, Whitsuntide or Easter, were simply names that had been created by the Catholic Church and were not biblically or apostolically mandated. They argued with quotes such as this, that those who followed these holy days as created by the Catholic Church were in fact apostates and were not following the true form of the religion that Christ and his apostles had established. Another quote from George Fox and Elias Hoax, again highlights the Quaker understanding that Christmas was created. It was a made-up holiday in order to help drive Christian numbers. That it was not part of the original true form of Christianity, and that it came about hundreds, if not thousands of years after the foundation of Christianity at the time of Christ and his apostles. It was a popish holiday, as Quakers would say. It was something that should not be celebrated, something that should be rejected, because it not only was not biblically sound, but also created a false worship, something that the Quakers strove admirably to try to do away with. We can also see that there, through multiple examples in Fox's writings, that Christmas was something that they understood the true nature of Christmas, and its inherent false worship that had been presented by the Pope. This quote shows that the Quakers understood that Christmas was not Christmas was not the celebration of the day Christ was born, but was something that was celebrated in order to celebrate Christ's birth. They understood that by reading the Bible and the examples within it, that Christmas most likely did not happen in the dead of winter, during the winter solstice. That Mary was probably not giving birth to Christ sometime around December 25th. Instead, most likely, sometime in either the spring or the fall. As you can also see, they also understood that Easter may or may not have happened during the time of Passover. that it was cold weather then, and that depending on the time, it probably didn't happen at that point. So we can see here that Quakers were reading the Bible, interpreting the Bible for themselves, and using that interpretation to reject those things which they believed were not biblically mandated. And this was an important part of the early Quaker experience, an attempt to try to find the true church, the primitive Christianity restored, which the Quakers were striving to create. And again, another quote that helps to show in clear language that the Quakers understood that these were things that were set up by papists, not by Christ and his apostles. They were, as they say in this quote, relics of popery, something that all Protestants were trying to strive against, but Quakers in particular sought to reject. And that's why, while some Protestant groups rejected the Pope and his authority, but didn't reject these other popish or popery created festivals, were the Quakers were going a step further and really seeking to revive these earlier primitive forms of Christianity. I have one more quote that I'm going to show that I think helps explains this. And I like this quote because it helps to show the true understanding that Quakers had, and the view that they were not only creating a primitive church, but that they were the one true set of Protestant Christians, that they were in the same power and spirit of the apostles, that they were in the same group, a continuation of the time of Christ, the time of Jesus, and the time of other groups. And that all of the various doctrines, commandments, ordinances, and traditions were an error, that they were moving the church further and further away from this power and spirits that the apostles were in, that they were limiting the ability for people to truly worship Christ and truly worship God in the way that Christ and his apostles had laid out in the scriptural texts. And so Quakers rejected the holy days. They rejected those days that they viewed as being papist, heathenist, pagan, and not part of true Christian worship. You can see this in the rejection of holy days, in the Quaker rejection of usual day names. We call days obviously first, second, third day, first, second, third month. We're in 12th month right now. So this was all tied together and really set the stage for the Quaker understanding of the Christmas time. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions. If you do have any questions, feel free to type them into the question box and I'll answer them. Just need a quick sip of water. So, well, I'm waiting to see if anybody has any questions. Okay. So the reason Christmas, so the question was, what was the reason that Christmas was outlawed in Boston? It's because Boston was settled by the Puritans, and the Puritans are the Pilgrims, and the Pilgrims were an extreme sect of Puritan English tradition. And they, like the Quakers, were attempting to reject any form of worship that was not biblically mandated. And something that I don't know if I'll mention later, but in fact, in New England, Christmas wasn't celebrated until publicly celebrated until the main time of year. I'm sorry, until it wasn't celebrated until the 18th century. So a couple hundred years after it had been settled. But that's a great question. Any other questions? Um, so I have another question here. Were other groups in England, in addition to Puritans and Quakers, rejecting celebration of Christmas? Yes, there were other groups. It was the English Civil War period, which the Quakers come out of, was in a time of much religious upheaval in England, and really, really shook the foundations of faith for many. And there were a lot of groups that popped up and existed at the time that were rejecting various traditional quote Christian practices, and those include groups like the Diggers, the Muggletonians, the Puritan or the Pilgrims, as I mentioned earlier, and some other Christian groups. All right. So, because the Quakers were speaking out against what was traditionally celebrated as a as by other groups, particularly after the restoration of the monarchy, um, Quakers suffered severe persecution for their refusal to recognize Christmas, and this was both punished by large fines, by imprisonments, and by attacks by the public. George Fox has a quote here. Whoa, I'm sorry. That helped to illustrate this. That because they did not observe the holy days and would do things like open their shops to the public, as well as other issues, they would be thrown in jail. They would be assaulted by rude multitudes, and sometimes their goods and services would be spoiled. Um, and in the sorry, um, so we can see that Quakers were seen as an other by the larger English Protestant community. And their celebration, or their refusal to celebrate Christmas, was a very large public demonstration of their otherness. Um, because the recognition of Christmas was a required part of the Church of England's um, religious experience and was royally decreed, Quakers could face severe punishment. And we can see examples of this from the collection of suffering of the people called Quakers by Joseph Bessie. So here we have an example of Thomas Hilliard and Joseph Norris, who were served by Captain Simon Musgrave, a justice of the peace, for opening their shop and refusing to close it when they were commanded to. Captain Musgrave then ordered the boys, and I'm not sure who the boys were. I'm guessing they were just local kids, to do violence against Thomas Hilliard and Joseph Norris by throwing stones through the windows of their shop, as well as spoiling their goods. When the boys were asked, they said they were ordered by the captain to come. Along with this, they were they did 40 shillings worth of damage and hurt one of their daughters. Along with this, we can also see Quakers. We can have an example of some of the fines that Quakers received for this. One Henry Birch was fined £23 for opening his shop on Christmas Day. And another, Thomas Pilgrim, was fined £20, 5 shilling for the same thing. I'm sorry, I was fined £80, 5 shillings for opening on Christmas Day. And these were significant fines. A good percentage of these businesses' wages. And so these were attempts by the religious as well as political authorities to try to knock Quakers back into line. And yet the Quakers refused to do this. And one of the most well-known quotes, or one of the most well-known pieces that Quakers turned to at this time and continue to turn to throughout their history, was the work by Robert Barclay in his Apology for the True Christian Martyrs. And I just wanted to share a quick quote from that. Sorry. And this was the quote, and you can see here at the bottom the part that I highlighted, where he really lays out that these days that are, quote, holy, have led people into a superstitious observation of them, being persuaded that all days are not alike, but and holy in the sight of God. This was an attempt to Barclay's work was an attempt to codify the Quaker theology into a more understandable form of worship and understanding. And the belief that he laid out here was the need for Quakers to reject those things that were appointed by the papacy and were an attempt to make Christianity more appealing to people. Quakers have used and continue to use Barclay's Apology to help formulate their beliefs and practices when it came to celebrations. And this quote you'll see throughout Quaker history in their rejection of the days that are not holy. He said that we are persuaded that all days are alike holy in the sight of God. And this really became the central understanding of Quakers for why they rejected Christmas and other celebrations. That God didn't want us to just celebrate himself or his magnificence a couple days a year, and the rest just do what we wanted to. For Quakers, it was a movement towards a religion that acknowledged the presence of God in their lives and the Holy Spirit in their lives every day that they lived. That they needed to live their faith each and every day, and not just reserve it for those few special holy days that the Catholic Church had prescribed. However, there is evidence that while Quakers rejected the typical celebrations revolving around Christmas and other feast days, in good Quaker tradition, they weren't going to just, they were going to use something to the best of their abilities and not just let it go to waste. We all know that Quakers are loath to waste anything. And so Quakers would use the time of holidays to have gatherings together, and use those times because it was a time that other people that allowed them to engage with one another in a way that they wouldn't necessarily be able to otherwise. And we can see here that London Yearly Meeting chose the time of Whitsuntide Week to gather together, not for any superstitious observations, but because it was a season of the year that best suited the general accommodation. So we can see that Quakers were trying to get together and use these holidays to their advantage in a way that I think most Quakers today would appreciate. All right, I'm going to pause here real quick and just see if there are any other questions. Actually, while I do that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in order to let you guys see me and just see if I have any other questions. So Sarah asks, there was a period when Catholics were vehemently persecuted in England and priests had to be hidden in safe houses, etc. Was this mostly over by the time of the English Civil War? Did early friends acknowledge that such persecutions had existed? By the time of the Civil War, the tensions between Catholics and Protestants still existed. And one of the reasons why the English Civil War started was an attempt by Protestants to sort of do away with Catholic traditions. With the restoration of the monarchy by Charles II, or under Charles II, there was an attempt to try to heal and bridge some of those gaps and bring together the country. And so while the monarch was still Protestant, Catholicism was still recognized. And Quakers certainly understood that persecution had existed. But early Quakers tended to focus more on Catholic persecution of Protestants under Catholic monarchs than they did Protestant persecution of Catholics under Protestant monarchs, which was probably a bit hypocritical, but it certainly was there. So the birth of Christ is definitely in the New Testament, although it's only in Paul had asked, why did George Fox assert that Christmas was non-biblical? It's not that he was rejecting the idea that Christ was born. It's that he was rejecting the creation of the Christmas holiday itself. His argument was, and not just Fox's, but other Protestant and early Quakers' argument was that Christmas itself, the celebration of the birth of Christ on December 25th, and the various traditions that had come up around it, those themselves were pagan in origin. We do not in the Bible have a specific time of year that Christ was born. What we have is the story of Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem, not finding room at the inn, the one that we all know. But it doesn't say in the middle of December or near the winter solstice or on December 25th. His argument was that specific day, that the mass surrounding Christmas and all masses in general had pagan origins and were only authoritated by the Catholic Church, not within the Bible itself. And it's one of the reasons why the Quakers, along with other Protestant groups, rejected Catholic Mass because of its pagan traditions. Now, I hope that answers Paul's question. And Alistair just wanted me to point out, and this is true, that the further north in Britain you go, the more anti-Catholic the population tended to be. And that in Scotland, it was only in the 1950s that Christmas was celebrated, partially due to this. And again, that's true. So the relationship between Christianity, Christmas, Protestantism, Catholicism is something that's been playing out for centuries, and wasn't just something that happened in the times of early Quakers, but was something that came about later. Rochelle, she asked, how do we get from this early Quaker rejection of Christmas to today when many most Quakers celebrate Christmas? That is the next part we're going to discuss, actually. So let me open up the PowerPoint and move on from there. So the Quaker reluctance to celebrate Christmas was something that continued through the 18th and early 19th centuries. It was something that Quakers struggled with. And it comes back to a concept that I like to teach my students. It's the idea that a hedge, or imagine a hedge. Okay, hold on, let me start. The concept is that groups create hedges, create boundaries around themselves in order to define themselves. Again, imagine a hedge around a house, the height of which separates the house from the outside world. And in order to distinguish insiders to a group from those outside of the group, members will adopt things like unique languages, diets, customs, dress, etc., to help set themselves apart from larger society. If you think about the Amish or Hasidic Jews, you can get an idea about what I'm talking about. This metaphorical hedge allows the group to create a sense of belonging and identity, which distinguishes themselves from others. And Quakers, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, were well known for their peculiarities, their peculiar forms of worship, their plain speech, plain dress, their odd names for days and months, and their refusal to celebrate holidays, amongst others. And for Quakers, being a relatively small group in many of the areas they lived, this need to create a hedge around themselves was vitally important and something that they actively strove to maintain. They believed that it was important to maintain a very high edge to distinguish themselves from others. And so for Quakers, this became very important. And the prohibition against Christmas continued through the early, the 18th and early 19th centuries. Here we have a piece from the Book of Old Discipline from Philadelphia, printed in 1806. And this was a statement, on the days, on the keeping of holy days and fast days, and the continued prohibition against it. That while the Quakers had a testimony against formal worship, they also had a testimony against the observance of public fasts, feasts, and what others term as holy days. Again, maintaining that early Quaker philosophy that we shouldn't be celebrating something that wasn't explicitly biblically mandated. And so we can see here that for early Quaker, for Quakers in the mid and early, or the 18th and early 19th century, this was still a very important thing. But as the 19th century progressed, Quaker attitudes on Christmas began to change. And this wasn't just happening in the Quaker world, it was happening in the US as well. While Quaker businesses and schools would remain open on Christmas Day, other aspects of the holiday season were slowly adopted by individual Quaker families. Um, this particularly happened as Quakers spread west through the US, and the nature of Quakerism evolved um, to more closely resemble other Protestant groups. Um, and so we can see, or we can understand that Quakers were beginning to bring down the hedge that they had held around them. So while you still have examples of Quakers being read out of meetings for not following Quaker traditions, it also is happening less and less, and certainly not as much as it was happening in the early 19th century. Um, in a book called Christmas Time in Pennsylvania, um, Don Yoder um, argues that while Quakers were against Christmas celebrations, some Quakers in mid 19th century Pennsylvania succumbed to a modified attention to Christmas, at least as a family festival. Particularly on a personal level, Quakers began to celebrate Christmas at home. And so while in meeting houses, you still wouldn't have Christmas celebrations, um, Quakers would often hold familial gatherings where they would get together and as a family. And while they may not have a Yule log or a Christmas tree, there would often be a Christmas dinner, sometimes an exchanging of gifts. And so you can see the larger Quaker world starting to slowly move in the direction, at least on a personal level, towards more openness to Christmas. So celebrations again will be more muted with family gathering together, um, and have a shared meal and acknowledge Christ's coming. So they wouldn't be celebrating certainly they wouldn't be celebrating a Christmas mass or attending a Christmas worship where there'd be singing and hymns and those kinds of things, but they would have Christmas celebrations together. Um, and certainly avoiding the drunken revelry that had been present in early Christian Christmas celebrations. Um, and by the early 20th century, Quakers were beginning to lower the hedge even more. Schisms, which had separated the early Quaker world based on doctrinal understandings of what it meant to be Quakers, such as the Hicksite Orthodox break, were beginning to be healed. And Quakers were starting to engage more and more with the Christmas holiday. In taking a look at the Haverford and Swarthmore College's archives, we can actually sort of start to see, particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, Christmas cards being exchanged between families and friends, Christmas notes being sent to one another, and even some publications and meetings minutes of muted, often candlelit celebrations of the Christmas holiday. And we can see in Quaker books of faith and practice this change as well. And this continued through to the modern times. From the yearly meeting of Friends in Christ, which is the second quote here, we can see that while they still hold that they still held that one day was not more holy than the other, and that all days were a gift of the Most High. And that exterior observances of the holidays, such as Christmas and Easter, were not necessarily still being allowed in Quaker meetings, but were certainly being allowed in personal Quaker celebrations. If you look at the French General Conference website, which is the top quote, you can see here that they do that they sort of hedge their bets both ways. That most Quakers celebrate a low-key Christmas as part of a cultural understanding. But Quakers do not celebrate religious holidays because they were, those earlier called holy days. So the change in Quaker attitude with Christmas also, again, it coincided with a change in understanding of Christmas on a cultural level. As Christmas has become more and more of a cultural holiday and less of a religious holiday for many people, Quakers also began to move in that way. And you can see here in the British Faith and Practice from 1994 that they'd really come to a full understanding of Quakerism. It mentions here that a testimony that had been held by early friends was that against the keeping of times and seasons, and that it's important to still recognize that all of life is sacramental, that all times are holy, and no time should be marked out as more holy than another. But they mention here that this is a testimony that seems to be dying of neglect, and that many friends keep Christmas on a personal as well as a corporate level. And you can see here that at the bottom, the author says, "I would hope that neither the testimony or the idea that not keeping days as separate holy days shouldn't die out, but that we need to understand that Christmas isn't necessarily more or less holy than any other day, but it is a day of celebration to be used." All right. Let's see. I'm going to answer a couple questions that have popped up here. The yearly meeting of Friends in Christ is a Western yearly meeting that I'm not sure of the geographic accompanying, but it is a Western U.S. meeting. That is it's a programmed meeting, and that is a more evangelical flavor to it than some other Quaker meetings. And that second quote was from, I have to look, I don't remember that was from sometime in the mid 20th century. I don't know the exact date it was from. Geez, I am running out of time, aren't I? I didn't realize how late it was going on. All right, so contemporary Christmas. Let's talk about contemporary Christmas for Quakers. Contemporary Quakers celebrate Christmas in many different ways. They have, 12th month dinners, candlelit Christmas Eve worships, with the reading of biblical Christmas stories, caroling after worship, potluck dinners, and all sorts of various things. Because given Quakerism's nature, there's no uniform way of practicing Christmas. And every Quaker meeting has their own way of doing, of practicing Christmas. Some communities will have celebrations leading up to Christmas. Some will have them on Christmas Eve. Some don't acknowledge it at all. Probably the most widely held practice is that of the candlelight Christmas celebration, and that is certainly the most popular, and one that is used today. It's usually held on Christmas Eve when Quakers will gather together in candlelit, often electric nowadays, and a time for Quakers to come together and celebrate and worship. So I just want to share one more slide that has I'm going to skip these last ones because they're not quiz. So this is a picture of a candlelit Christmas Eve celebration at a Quaker meeting. I'm not sure what meeting this is from. I couldn't track it down. But this is the most typical celebration of Christmas that you'll see. one that is held in many meetings across the globe. And it's a time for Quakers to come together, gather together and reflect on not just Christmas, but also the year that they've lived. And it's a time for gathering, worship, and togetherness. All right, I'm going to stop there. If there are any other questions, please feel free to post them. I will try to answer them as much as possible. I'm sorry for running a little late. Okay, Susan says that was the George School Christmas meeting. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. I wasn't quite sure what meeting house that was. I'll ask Rachel this question. Rachel, I was wondering if people were interested in getting a copy of either the PowerPoint or the script, if I can make that available to people.
Yes, you can send it to me and then I can send it out to everyone.
Sure.
I had a few questions about the PowerPoint.
Sure. Cool. Okay, one question that I just saw pop up in the chat is, do you think we still have an edge or a need for a hedge today between France and the rest of the world? That's a really interesting question, Hope. I think that we certainly don't have as much of a hedge as we used to. And it's something that I think, it comes out more in our corporate worship time together as opposed to our everyday lives. I guess I personally feel like I'd rather have Quakers engaging with the world and presenting themselves as examples in their everyday lives and be approachable. And so personally, I would say we don't have a need for a hedge. On the other hand, I certainly know Quakers who wish we had more of one, and wish that we had more of a way of distinguishing ourselves from others. It's a really tough question, and one that I think Quakers are constantly engaging with throughout our times. And so I think that we are constantly revisiting that, and it is something that I think Quakers struggle with. How do we identify ourselves as Quaker in a world where the thing that most people understand about Quakers is the Quaker Oats guy? Right. If there are any other questions, I will be happy to answer them. All right. Well, okay. Do you know how pestilence and pandemics affect us, Craig? Hope is asking a relatively interesting question about pestilence and pandemics affected Friends worship in the past. I do not, Hope. Specifically, I don't know anything about like the 1918 flu and how that influenced Quakers. It'd be an interesting thing to look back at Quaker minutes from Meeting for Worship and Meeting for Business at that time. Something that I actually, now that you said it, I may look into. That would make an interesting article for Friends Journal, and something that I think certainly would be interested in looking at. I'm sure they did affect them. How much, I don't know. But that's actually a really good question, something that I'm now personally very interested in learning about too. Well, I'll hang out here for another couple of minutes, and if there are any other questions that pop up, otherwise, let's say it's 7:40, we'll wrap it up.
Great, and I just want to thank everyone who attended tonight's lecture, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your night.
And actually, I will put my email in the chat. And if anybody has any questions or anything they'd like to ask me directly, feel free to email me anytime. and be happy to talk to you about anything, whether it's tonight's lecture or my dissertation work on Quakerism and heresy.